it's welcomed. And it's a long time due sort of central topic to us here in the developing world. And I think we'll have discussions about that. We don't see, I would say, policy challenges. I mean, let me put it in a question form. Do we see development challenges through the same lenses, and do we have the same understanding of, let's say, current challenges in low and middle income countries of this continent? We could expand, but let's say Africa. And is it more about financing development? And we have a great starting panel with Alexia and Marcus here. Mark. So for us here at the Policy Center, it's really growth, and it's more difficult, but because there's nothing to be against. It's easy to be against something, so there's no more Washington consensus. So we have to think, what do you do with your freedom? Anxiety, I'm free. I wake up in the morning, there's nothing I can be against. So we have to invent, and it's messy. It's tougher, because the environment is, of course, no secret, is more difficult. So there's no meetings of economists where we don't talk about geopolitics, and but that's part of the environment. Shocks, multiple shocks. Oil those days, Morocco, for instance, is a 100% importing fossil fuel economy. Many on this continent. Others have oil. What they do with it, how they make sure that there is this intergenerational sort of smart policies that make sense, that are also morally grounded, I would say. So many issues, many topics. So we have a fantastic program. We will touch upon many of those things. But I wanted to share with you a little bit the mentality, the mental posture here, and I would say on the continent. Most policymakers really what they have on the table is, how do I create employment? How do I, jobs? How do I attract foreign direct investment? How I make sure there are spillovers, positive externalities in the economy? How do I increase trade? How do I deal with competition? How I invest in infrastructure? How I manage my fiscal constraint? And I'll close on that. That's medium, long-term growth, but in the short run, there are many challenges. Most countries are, so in a way, in not, would say, complete failure situation, but most countries are over indebted. That doesn't mean that let's make sure we don't think only debt sustainability analysis, which is a very poor and crude framework. You should add to it what am I missing in terms of opportunities. It's not just balancing the budget, it's preparing for the future and stimulating growth. So you have to have a broader view of things. Even the IMF is becoming a little bit artistic about that, to say least. I think we have discussions on that as well. But if there's a lesson we can draw from Morocco, is that you need to make sure your macro is in order. Otherwise, you don't have any margin of maneuver. It's a very simple, but let's revisit this. There will be panels on that. So I'll close on that. I'm really looking forward to our discussions, but also to meet you over coffee and lunch. So once again, welcome to the Policy Center for the New South. We're very glad to have you with us, and I hope you enjoy those 2 days here in Rabat and elsewhere if you're making the trip to Tangier, I guess, with our friends. Thank you very much.
So I'm the middle introduction. Karim gave us the foundation, and Shema's going to tell us what success looks like. I'm going to do something different, which is, first of all, thank the PCNS for hosting us in their beautiful facility. And then I'm going to welcome all of you with an ask. So when we put together this conference, we collectively tried to get a group of eclectic people. A lot of these conferences are echo chambers with people who speak predominantly to each other. So we've tried to break that mold, and it's an eclectic group, eclectic and electric. You'll hear something about power tomorrow. And so what I would like to ask all of you is to catch up with your old friends, but also meet somebody new as you go through the days and hear new ideas from different people. I'm an introvert, so this is hard for me. But I ask all of us, introverts and extroverts, to meet new people. And so with that, welcome and have a great couple of days.
Hi everyone, good morning. Marhaba to Rabat. So thank you to Marcus and Karim for the introductions. This summit has been like a baby. It's been 9 months of process, of preparation, and we've put a lot of great deal of care and thoughts into preparing the content and to shaping it in a way that responds to the current geopolitics and the current dynamics that are shifting. And within good African spirit, it's been, there was a village of organizations supporting it. First, thanks to PCNS for hosting us in beautiful Morocco and for your seamless collaboration. To CGD for your continued partnership and support. This is the second edition of the Growth Summit that we organized together. For Coefficient Given for continued funding of the summit. To Gatsby Africa for not only contributing to the funding, but also organizing an important panel on what does success look like when we talk about structural transformation and sectoral transformation. To African Climate Foundation for also funding the event, and then to Africa Urban Lab, Energy for Growth Hub, and Growth Firms Alliance for organizing panels around key drivers of economic growth. As I told you, it really is a village. And of course, thank you all for coming from all over the world in a very highly disrupted airspace, to say the least. We had to rebook many travels due to what's happening in the Middle East. We sincerely hope that what we have prepared will meet your intellectual curiosity, spark new ideas, foster new partnerships, all in the service of economic transformation in developing countries. This is the second edition that we're organizing of Growth Summit, which we aim to continue building as an agora of ideas and learning for all of those who are committed to lifting people out of poverty, specifically in Africa. When we started growth teams, we were struck by the lack of focus on within the development community on what really matters. How to help developing countries embark on structural transformation and lift their people out of poverty. Most of the conversations, discussions, and as a consequence, funding has been focused on what we see more as symptoms rather than the root causes. We heard a lot about SMEs, youth employment, women integration in the labor force, formalizing the informal economy. And while these are important subjects, we see them as a byproduct of structural transformation. And actually, they have become sort of the catchy words that have directed sort of overwhelming majority of actors within the development community, and eventually crowding out the harder, potentially seen as messier and more difficult conversation about growth and structural transformation. So we acted. We organized the first edition of the Growth Summit a year and a half ago in Washington with CGD. And we wanted the second edition to be in an African country, and more precisely in an African country that has been doing great progress on structural transformation. And that's why we chose Morocco, and we're lucky to have a good partner in PCNS for that. And here we go now. So we have the second edition with a growing list of participants and partners. We hear a lot in conferences and we read a lot in reports that we are in a turning point or there are unprecedented times. And while in the past those words might have seemed hyperbolic and performative, we are in a turning point today. And we are in a crossroad, potentially one of the most significant of our lifetime. When it comes to growth and structural transformation, there are at least 5 paradigms shifting. First, the profound shift in the global economic order, the trade rules, a cornerstone of the global economy that developing countries were told were non-negotiable, are being turned up by the very countries that have designed them. The once called the policy that should not be named is back and is here to stay. Industrial policy is politically legitimate again, and after 30 years of Washington consensus ruling. Third, the green transition is reshaping not only what industrialization can and should look like, creating new value chains, new technologies, but also creating new rules that might negatively affect developing countries like the CBAM. Fourth, the aid industry and its architecture that have financed development is fracturing with the collapse of USAID and the collapse of budget allocated by different bilateral agencies to aid. And finally, last but not least, the rise of AI and the huge progress that this technology is making on a monthly basis makes any type of prediction on its impact on structural transformation feels more like an oracle game. With such powerful shifts, obviously there is uncertainty, anxiety, but there are also clear opportunities, as Dr. Karim mentioned, for developing countries. But this sort of bigger policy space needs to be taken responsibly forward. It needs to be seized carefully, pragmatically, learning from what has worked and what hasn't. And this is where we see important role for organizations like ours, growth teams, to help government and countries in Africa seize the right opportunities in the right way to advance on the convergence process. We've shaped the agenda of the summit around these different paradigms that are shifting, and we will consider the summit a success if policymakers in the room not only learn from other countries' paths, but also think, how can I take this home and apply it? It would be a success if funders leave the room with a sharper, more honest answer to the question, are we really funding what matters or what's easier to count and follow? And finally, it would be a success if practitioners also iterate on their ways of working to serve governments in a way that truly builds their country's capabilities, be it industrial capabilities or policy-making ones. We have 3 days, and we are confident that we have the right people in the room to spark the right ideas, hopefully the right subjects, and so no excuses to leave the room without something real. Welcome to the Growth Summit, and thank you all for being here.
The esteemed speakers, please remain on the stage for the group photo. Ladies and gentlemen, we will now move on to our first keynote titled Global Geopolitics, Policy Space and Development Pathways. Please join me in welcoming Alexia Latortue, Head of Secretariat at the Future of Development Cooperation Coalition, Mark Malloch-Brown, former President at Open Society Foundations, and Aynaoui Depolou, former Special Advisor to the President for Economic Matters at the Office of the Vice President of Nigeria. Alexia Latortue, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Good morning, everyone. Bonjour. I'm thrilled to be here. I absolutely love the focus of the summit, economic growth. Voilà, I'm thrilled to be here. Much better. Bonjour. Good morning, everybody. I absolutely love the focus of the summit, economic growth, a meaningful, relevant topic that is making a comeback. I agree, Karim, even though it's not always as central to all the conversations as it should be. I also very much agree with Marcus. The composition of this group is extraordinary. Thank you very much to the growth teams, to Center for Global Development, and to the new Policy Center for the New South for being our hosts. So the moment that we are in, yes, Shema, it is a crossroads. It's a turning point. I think I want to be clear. I think it's a moment that also is very difficult, one that is the cause of much disappointment. I would say sometimes even despair, and even, as we all know, dangerous time. However, I also believe it's a moment of profound opportunity. And so Karim talked about how do we use this newfound freedom? And I think that's our challenge. How do we use our creative juices, our energy, our brain power, our analytical evidence to be able to shape what comes next? And I think you cannot get around the fact that what matters for any country to progress is economic growth. It matters to countries, it matters to creating opportunities for people, and yes, it matters for the planet. As Nick Stern says, climate action is the growth story of the 21st century. But of course, we don't want any type of growth. We want quality growth, or as the African Center for Economic Transformation says, we want growth with depth. And I'm delighted to have this panel here to help us explore these issues, starting with our keynote speaker, who is a Renaissance man, I dare say, who will help us understand this geopolitical moment and what it means for developing countries' policy space and growth prospects. Sir Mark Malik Brown has done it all. He's done international affairs, development, business, philanthropy, communications, former minister, former chief of staff to my favorite Secretary General, Kofi Annan, Deputy Secretary General, most recently, president of the Open Society Foundation. Over to you, Mark Malik Brown.
Alexia, thank you. And that was a very kind introduction. I think we're all at a dark moment in politics where it's rather nice to be called a Renaissance man. I hope the historic better reference isn't that we're entering a dark age. Let's assume you're right. We're coming out. So your Renaissance man is delighted to talk to you all on that, under that title. But let me also thank our hosts. This is a wonderful occasion, and Karim, you and the Centre are really playing an ever more important part in the whole sort of intellectual leadership around development and creating a perspective from the global south, which I think is formidable and important. So thank you, and thank you to the co-hosts, of course, as well, and particularly all my friends at CGD. Let me just say that, as Chema said, we in a way already have a problem that as a keynoter, there's no superlative left in which to describe the current situation. So I struggled in the land of fables to try and find a theme for what I wanted to say. And I came up with an elephant, a blind man, and an endangered species. The endangered species bit is easy. It's the whole development finance system that we have grown up with, which is, I suspect, under terminal threat. And I think many in this room might concur with that. The elephant and the blind man are perhaps a bit harder, but what I have in mind is the current fragmenting geopolitical order, where touch different parts, as in the fable a blind man does, and he feels a leg or he feels a foot, but he can't see the whole elephant. And I think we're at that moment with the breakdown of the geopolitical system. we see the different parts. We see the extraordinary ambiguity of America's role today, the sort of techno-military sophistication of the wars that President Trump has launched, and yet the crumbling of the democratic politics of the US, and subsequently, particularly in recent weeks, the apparent crumbling of much of the international alliances of the United States as well. So a country whose power has been inverted from that of values and politics and democracy to very much a military power who is stalled on those other softer power dimensions. We see the rise of the middle powers, and we see it, frankly, at this point, still quite often in a fairly defensive way. It's captured in the phrase of Mark Carney at Davos: if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. And a reason, therefore, for middle powers to organize, to force a place at the table, to make sure that their voice is heard. And we see a massive rebalancing between global regions. I have just done a report with two others on the Bretton Woods at 80 for the leadership of those two institutions. And as we did our own qualitative conversations around the world and looked at the quantitative polling, we saw a world in a series of very different places in terms of political optimism about the future. We saw Asia with an optimism reflecting the strong growth fundamentals of many of its economies. We saw Europe and North America in exactly the political political spot that you might anticipate for countries whose politics have, in a sense, become so mercurial and so captured in many ways by parties representing the marginalized former blue-collar and middle classes in those countries. And we saw Africa as the swing vote, if you like, with areas both of great optimism about the future, but other areas of great pessimism and doubt and caution about what the future was going to bring. But that polling and conversations in our minds reflects a fundamental reordering of global politics in a regional geographic way. And of course, one of the consequences of this sort of geopolitical change is the chronic weakness of the 20th century multilateral system at the end of the second decade or into the third decade of the 21st century. A system that had looked so formidable and ambitious at the time of its forming in 1945, now is one struggling to adjust to these very changed political realities. Its founders, the so-called P5s, the allies, the winners of the Second World War, are themselves hardly in all cases great champions anymore of its values and principles and norms. But they still are at the heart of its functioning as a system. Critical shareholders, key shareholders in the Bretton Woods institutions, waivers and holders of the veto at the United Nations. And so we see a challenged international system that simply isn't responding fast enough to the changes within its membership. And then for development finance, the other half of the proposition in our conference's title, all of this has created or contributed to a moment of almost a perfect storm where the traditional donors have been pulling back dramatically. And again, there's a risk that we always see Donald Trump as the cause rather than the trigger of something which has a longer term root to it. And with the meltdown of ODA, I think that is a classic case. The Doge closing of USAID was such a dramatic event that it's framed the apparent meltdown of ODA. But in fact, my country, the United Kingdom, led by a Labour government, has cut ODA more than the United States has, proportionately, and cuts across all of Europe are pursuing a similar thing. So hence my endangered species. But it's a challenge not just because of a loss of political support in donor countries, which has made these budgets an easy target for governments seeking resources for their own absence of growth in their economies and for their growing defense requirements. But it's also become a challenged model, of course, in the countries of the developing world, the global south, where the sort of fragmentation of aid flows, the uncertainty of their duration and predictability, their donor-driven sense of priorities, has led to an increasing impatience and exasperation amongst many of you in the room and your colleagues in government who've simply found them not the basis on which you can place long-term development strategy, planning and investment. So there is, in a sense, a perfect storm which has engulfed ODA. It's the cuts were not met with the outrage either amongst publics in the global north or policymakers in the global south that might have been anticipated, despite their desperate cost in terms of lives risked and put at risk. So let me just offer a few suggestions as to where development finance is going. In this report I referred to, the Bretton Woods at 80, we saw this crisis of confidence in development finance only being resolved by a remodeling of the system to, in a very fundamental way, put countries in charge of their own development destiny and choices. And that in the future, the financing models would come in support of a country strategy rather than behind imposed external priorities. Not a very profound point, but an extraordinarily important one in terms of the structure of development institutions. And of course, the financing we anticipated would be a very different mix of private and public monies. But we also recognize that the MDBs are a fast-growing portion of the totality of concessional development finance. The UN has been decimated in the development space by these cuts. So within the multilateral frame particularly, the MDBs are now more dominant than ever as a proportion of the funding. And therefore, the governance point, our third one, is critical, that going back to my point about the disconnect, the discontinuity between power today and its reflection in the governance of these institutions, we argued strongly that the boards have to be remade to better reflect the realities of today. But if there is a second theme in the future of development finance, and again, not a hugely original one, it is that remaking of the private sector and of private sources of finance. But, you know, Karim asked at the beginning who was around in the 1970s, and I'm afraid I was one of those who was. And you've just aged a lot better than me, Karim. But, you know, one of the other features of the 1970s was a very, very heavy investment in infrastructure versus people. And I think we can see as we shift back towards a more private sector model that already edging its way back into the center of the development equation and its priorities. I think there'll be a whole series of discussions over the next 2 days about mitigating risk for the private sector, bundling loans, something that the MDBs, for example, are now looking at. And all of these are going to be critical and important conversations. But I think we also have to realize that what we have to guard against above all else is such a triumph of interests over values in the new development equation that, you know, the example written up by DevEx in recent days of Zambia, where the US has promised renewed support to its health system, but in return for concessions on critical minerals mining in that country. And if we're back to that world, which is again a 1970s world, I was part of the generation that felt we'd rescued development finance from national political priorities. There was a famous dam in Malaysia, Pergau, which had clearly been tied up in corrupt payments and was deeply involved in Margaret Thatcher's political agenda at the time. And while she meant no harm, the thing led to a lot of corruption, and the founding of the British Department of International Development was very much a reaction to that national interest-driven development policy. Well, that's, of course, where we are now going back to very, very rapidly. So what is, or risk going back to, so what is the future of a much smaller ODA pool? Because it's not going away entirely, and I'm sure in many ways we may have seen the trough, and it may start to creep back, at least in some countries. Well, I think it's going to be something which is a much more defendable, ring-fenced financing for goals that Western publics, and indeed publics in new donor countries, can collectively support and mutually understand. So I suspect we will see growing resources for humanitarian conflicts, not least because their numbers are tragically likely to increase in this new world. Second, a focus on fragile states, which are unlikely to attract not just private funding, but frankly effective MDB funding as well, given their instability. Third, health and education, where I'm sure there will be residual funding. And of course, fourth, global public goods, most notably climate. But that's already a big pool of things, and it's not clear how well the reduced resources will stretch to cover them. So let me just return for a moment in closing to geopolitics and the interplay of that breaking political order. With the whole issue of global economic growth, it's to step back to 100,000 feet, not even 30,000, but the single driver, arguably, of what is going on in the politics, or single primary driver of what's going on in the politics of the West at the moment, is voter groups threatened by change. Whether it is in US or Europe, coalitions of those marginalized by economic changes in their countries are increasingly seizing power. The Brexit vote in the UK, the Trump coalition in the US, the challenges in France, Germany, etc., Italy as well. All of these reflect this dramatic shift in the sort of base of politics. Second, I've said it, the rise of China, but also more widely of Asia, and the dramatic change that presages in world affairs, that swing vote of Africa. A famous book recently by, you will all remember it, the Thucydides Trap, talked about what happens when one empire goes down and another one goes up, that dangerous moment of conflict as they pass each other. But I think here we have more of a Thucydides puzzle, because it's not clear that one hegemon is going to replace another. It's more likely that, particularly in the multilateral system, we see the emerging grouping of powers who mutually commit to a cooperative framework of multilateralism, but one where they all have to stand up and, in a sense, be counted. And I think this is where the Policy Centre for the New South is such an important voice as we frame that discussion. But I think we do need to remember that just as the original multilateral system was a messy business, today, as the founders, for different reasons, maybe step aside or step up into emeritus roles, and the heirs wait in the wings, we need to recognize that we're likely to see not just new constellations of power, but new institutions, certainly new governances of them, and new purposes. And within that, a much more untidy multilateralism of minilateralism and coalitions, rather than universal agreement on anything. But it will, as always with multilateralism, be a strange, paradoxical mix of high principle and low politics, of expediency versus principle, of great vision, but also great vanity amongst many leaders. And we will muddle our way through, but hopefully to a system that can deliver both a renewed framework for geopolitics, but also a renewed framework for global growth and global economic cooperation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mark. A messy, complex world, but you did end on a slightly, I think, dare say, optimistic tone, I think. So very happy now to also have a fabulous discussant, Mr. Aynaoui Depilos, who I just recently met, who also has had quite a varied career as a diplomat, an economist, and a public administrator. And he will help us now bring a view from Africa and to really understand what this moment means for Africa, what is being underappreciated, what needs more attention, and your vantage point as the former special advisor for economic affairs to the former vice president of Nigeria, whose name you'd share, Yemi Osinbajo, is incredibly helpful in that regard, but also a deep experience as a Nigerian foreign service official across several continents, as well as work with UNECA. So really delighted to hear from you. Yemi, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Alexia. My thanks also to the Policy Center for the New South, the Center for Global Development and Growth teams for inviting me. And appreciation to Lord Malloch-Brown for his expansive worldview that makes my task a bit easier, just a bit. Good morning, everybody. There is an apocryphal ancient Chinese curse that says, may you live in interesting times. I don't know what this generation has done to deserve it, but this curse is certainly upon us. There's so much uncertainty, upheaval, and conflict all around. The liberal world order, which dominated geopolitics since 1945, was in many ways a force for good. It promoted, amongst other things, political values like self-determination, peaceful settlement of disputes, and refraining from the threat of the use of force. On the economic side, globalization, aided partly by advances in transport and communications, and reductions in transactions costs, facilitated trade, finance, and investment, and enabled the spread of technological progress. In addition, aid and technical assistance supported the development process, while multilateralism enabled the coordination of rules underpinning the liberal order. These things led to significant advances across the globe. There was enough peace to enable great progress in poverty reduction, education, and health. Indeed, the period since 1945 has been described by some authors as the long peace. And we all know, of course, that China alone lifted over 800 million people out of poverty since 1990. For a moment, the world seemed to be moving towards liberal democracy and open economies, and there were claims that we were witnessing the end of history. That order is now fast unraveling. The old might is right approach has reemerged in international peace and security. There have been sharp declines in aid and technical cooperation, and globalization is being replaced with the weaponization of interdependence, including through tariff escalations, financial sanctions, and the disruption of supply chains. Multilateralism, which greatly benefited small countries by giving them a voice in articulating global rules and norms, is now in recession, with the United Nations, for instance, playing a much reduced role in conflict resolution and international development. The point must be made, however, that the liberal world order was not an unmitigated good. That famous speech again, Prime Minister Mike Carney of Canada put it very succinctly in his Davos speech when he said, "We knew the story of the international rules-based order was partially false, that the strongest would exempt themselves when convenient, and, I have paraphrased it, that trade rules were enforced asymmetrically." Indeed, the liberal order opened the gate for its more virulent cousin, neoliberalism, which, guided by the mantra stabilize, liberalize, and privatize, ruled the world in the 80s and the 90s. And this was complemented by rules restricting flexibility in the use of policies and strategies used by nearly all successful economies. Some of the things that were restricted or could not be used were linked directly to industrial policy, including tariff policy, sector-specific subsidies, offset arrangements, performance requirements, and the protection of infant industry. These were included in WTO instruments, preferential trade agreements, and investment treaties, which demanded reciprocity and offered no flexibilities, unlike Part 4 of GATT of 1964, which introduced development as a core part of the international trading system. These outcomes were disappointing, to say the least, and the 1980s and 90s became to be known as Africa's lost decades. This poor outcome made developing countries realize that they had been left with the short end of the stick, especially as countries like China and Vietnam, which deployed industrial policies actively, were the most successful economies in that time period. They began to demand for policy space or the freedom to choose the best mix of policies for their economic development, given their own circumstances. The upending of the liberal economic order has led some to believe that it's now a good opportunity to adopt and implement industrial policies in Africa. This is unlikely to be a walk in the park. To start with, the return of industrial policy does not quite reflect a change of heart. Rather, developed countries resorted to industrial policies to overcome the effects of the 2008 global financial crisis and to respond to the challenges posed by climate change, digital technologies, and indeed the COVID-19 pandemic. Moreover, the demise of the liberal order in developed countries is not in pursuit of a fairer world, but to promote national interests, and so the attitudes, institutions, and architecture that constrain policy space are still quite intact. In any case, African countries lack the bargaining power to force renegotiation. And perhaps more critical and more troubling, we have not used the flexibilities that are already available in any meaningful way, except in a few countries. Before turning to development pathways that are required, at this time, we must remember that based on empirical evidence, the main objective is the structural transformation of African economies in a way that creates jobs, adds value to commodities and critical minerals, reduces poverty, protects the planet, and improves the quality of life for the general population. That's always been tough to articulate development pathways, and even more tricky now because of the rapidly changing global environment. The opportunities for using old pathways based on labor-intensive and export-oriented manufacturing are closing due to the increased use of robotics, reshoring, and trade restrictions. It gets even more complicated when we consider the need to respond to climate change and to factor in the use of digital technologies, especially artificial intelligence. Politicians and senior policymakers who have to respond to the urgent demands of the population have very little patience for this kind of arguments. They would prefer and indeed demand blueprints to guide development. The problem is that there is no unique set of policies to bring about structural transformation, given differences in country circumstances, endowments, and history. As the Nobel Prize-winning economist Bob Solow is reported to have told his colleagues on the Growth Commission, a list of ingredients is not a dish. Taking this into account and drawing on the experiences of successful African countries, success in quotes, that have made some headway and towards attaining structural transformation, I think it's more prudent to call for the adoption of developmentalist attitudes in African countries. This would require, one, forging political commitments to structural transformation by building developmental coalitions, which include the private sector, civil society organizations, and of course the public sector, and to focus the national discourse on development. Second, having a clear vision underpinned by normative standards, which realizes that macroeconomic stability, while important, is insufficient, and that structural transformation requires industrial policies that support the use of green opportunities inherent in agriculture, manufacturing, and high-end services. Three, building state capacity for close management of the process of structural transformation, especially improving coordination with the private sector and between government institutions. The capacity to resolve economic conflicts is a crucial requirement in this regard. Finally, maximizing the use of international opportunities for learning to shape the rules, to access markets, to attract finance, including ODA and loans, and to promote regional integration in Africa, especially through the African Continental Free Trade Area. Ultimately, policy space can only be used in our now changing and somewhat chaotic global order by countries that recognize that structural transformation matters and that they have to use their own processes and procedures to promote productivity, mobilize capital, implement plans, resist political pressures, and support technological growth. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Yemi. So no blueprint, but some very important pointers. So just to give a heads up to the audience, we'll be coming out to you for questions in a few minutes. But I want to start with actually a success story that you did allude to, Yemi, from Morocco, and looking at the car industry here, right? So in 3 decades, going from about $29 million worth of exports to $7 billion worth of exports, the king, prime minister, trade minister, finance minister, industry, yes, an international partner with Renault, with a $1.4 billion investment in this country, the largest Renault factory in Tanger, largest private sector employer in Morocco. Huge success story, deep partnerships within the country, and again, with an external partner. Yemi, I'm going to start with you. How replicable is the type of coalition that it took, the Team Maroc, with an international partner to get this kind of a success story? How replicable is this example?
Thank you very much, Alexia. I think the center of my remarks was to say replicability is the most difficult thing. And I think just to go back a bit, that one of the reasons why structural adjustment failed in Africa was that we didn't factor in the difficulties of replicability, given different circumstances, given different histories. But there is a sense in which some things are replicable. And I like the Moroccan example you gave. I will complement that, and let's put aside some recent developments with the example, say, of Ethiopia, for instance, which was one of the world's poorest countries and beset by all sorts of crises. But over time, rose to be able to overcome the challenges they faced in agriculture, such that when there were droughts subsequently, they didn't have famines. Were able to undertake a bit of manufacturing and built highly successful industrial parks. I had the privilege of visiting one in Hawassa, run by Akabe Okube. And what was most fascinating about it, apart from the fact that we were right in the middle of some place in Ethiopia and that they were making goods that were going to be sold in advanced economy markets. Some of the shirts you are wearing were probably manufactured in Ethiopia. But most striking was, even at that point in time, it was a climate-friendly environment. So in building that park, they had made sure that the amount of emissions, which can be quite large in the textile sector, were mitigated by making sure that they recirculated their water. What I'm trying to make is that replicability would be difficult because country circumstances are different. Not many countries can benefit from the political arrangements that you have in Morocco. Several countries are trying to contend with what I call messy democracy. So governments are focused on winning the next election and finding themselves, when they try bold things, having to scramble very quickly to ensure that the electorate doesn't take it out on them in the next election. So, yeah, replicable in the sense of those four things I spoke about, though. Build a political coalition by whatever means. Mauritius has shown that it's possible to build a developmental coalition in the face of democracy. It's, I think, very important to build state capacity. Everybody thinks that the South Korean was a fantastic case of how the state led development. But reading Ha Jung-chang closely, you find that the capacity to run the economy was being built as the economy was growing. It wasn't just something ready-made there, So again, but perhaps equally important, using the global system as best as you can. The truth of the matter is the liberal order did allow a lot of countries to grow using export-oriented industrialization. Not everybody could use that, but it was available. There were preferences which might no longer be available, but there were rules that helped you to take advantage of the system if you decided to do so. But I think ultimately, and I like to say this all the time, it's about political commitment. If the government is committed and uses that word you used earlier, I can't remember who used it. Yeah, sorry, it was Karim. Energy. There's been the danger, and forgive me for saying this, but the danger, there was a narrative that, just liberalize, just devalue, just balance, and everything will be okay. I have experience of countries where they've done all that, and now they are floundering as to what do we do next.
Staying with you, Yemi, an unfair question, but I'm still going to ask it because I think your point around political will and I think your point around state capacity are so important. And people often turn immediately to the private sector when it comes to questions of growth. And obviously the private sector and the partnership with the private sector is key. But that state capacity is fundamental. What have you learned through your work in terms of how to invest in that state capacity, how to bolster that state capacity? I know there's no secret sauce, I imagine, but what can you share with your lessons learned to really bolster that state capacity?
Again, it's a tricky one. I'll use two illustrations. First is I used to run some training programs at ECA for African countries, and we'll invite so many people to countries. We'll sponsor 2 people, we'll talk about all sorts of things. One particular country never responded to those invitations. But when I organized a training session for economic negotiators and offered 2 spaces per country, this country, which had never responded to any of my previous interesting seminars, said, we'll take those 2 and we'll pay for another 2. I'm pointing to the seriousness of government in saying that this matters because we always get the short end of the stick when negotiating. That's the first example I like to give. So again, it has to be something that is consciously done. The second example I'd like to give is that there's so much going on, there's so much going on that it gets very difficult to get government to pay attention to developing state capacity. And again, there's this issue of just give it to the private sector. The truth of the matter, and Prime Minister Meles used to say this, that he opened up that and said, where's that investment? It never came. Never came, But the point I'm trying to make is that state capacity can be built consciously. What I'm trying to say without saying so much is that it's one of the first things I tried to do. Even though I was in charge of economic matters, I went to the head of the civil service to say, we've got to fix this. And a lot of effort has gone into trying to fix it. But the most challenging thing, I think, is that we don't know how to put the genie back into the lamp. So salaries, and very personal example, I was a public servant, junior one. But I joined the public service deliberately. All my colleagues went to banking, and maybe with hindsight I should have. But the point is that I woke up one morning, and because of devaluation, which probably needed to be done, I moved from a salary on which I could survive into a very, very embarrassing salary, which I would not mention, overnight. And what are the options that you face in such a circumstance? Who then is going to join the public service after you? So I think it's a hard thing, but again, it boils down to political commitment, that the government protects and promotes the state sector without allowing abuse. Normative standards. There must be normative standards. Lee Kuan Yew said, and I end there, that it's really very silly to put a man on who cannot live on his salary in charge of billions of naira or dollars.
Thank you so much. Mark, turning to you, I think, we care not just about growth, right? But we care about job-rich growth. We care about growth that protects the planet. We care about resilient growth in this uncertain environment that everyone's been talking about. Both of you have talked about where supply routes can change overnight, where trade rules are changing all the time, the advance of AI. From your experience, how do you think about quality of growth? How do you think about resilient growth, knowing that it's not just about doing all the right things as a country, but market opportunities shift and can shift quite suddenly? What would be your advice to governments?
Well, I'm going to start, Alexia, if I may, by going back to your provocative question about, does it take a car factory to make development? And I'm doing that because when I was doing this Bretton Woods report, one of my two co-authors was Patrick Archie, a former Prime Minister of Côte d'Ivoire. And we came here to Morocco, actually, and Patrick had a slack jaw throughout the whole visit by his own admission, because, when he as a young man had come to Morocco, having just started life as a postgraduate consultant back home in Côte d'Ivoire, Côte d'Ivoire was much more developed than Morocco. Many more high roads, schools, you name it. It had a sort of legacy of French development, which had, in his mind, sort of spoilt it about making the hard choices about subsequent development. And, he felt particularly chagrined about this because he was Minister of Infrastructure for 16 years, and he comes back, and Morocco has an expansive road system, and I say that because, as we talked to Moroccans, the central bank governor, who's been central bank governor since the beginning of time, I think it would be fair to say, and who has a sort of memory going back to the beginning of, under not this king, but his father, that moment where the country really was near a precipice, student frustrations, etc., and then calling in a group of young technocrats and saying, develop this country. And from that moment of political crisis came a plan in the early years, very under-resourced, but with a formidable political will to modernize the country and get the politics back on track. And time after time, those are the countries that make it, I think, and one has to say that. And I know there are various authors in the room who believe in that sort of theory of strong political will and consistent, sustained leadership, and Yemi as well. So turning just to the quality of growth, I take Yemi's cautions about, industrialization and not applying a model just loosely borrowed from somewhere else. And not least because one of the things which has been increasingly troubling me is applying Western norms about employment to the growth model of Africa, and assuming if people are not in formal employment, they're unemployed. And I know I'm being simplistic, but to make a point, which is, actually, Africa got to the 0 hours contract long before Western countries did, with people having a multiple of different roles, some seasonal, some not, many held at the same time. And I do think as we look at quality of growth issues, and it goes to what you said, Jimmy, in the beginning about what to measure and what not to measure, if we want to see a more industrial model for Africa, we really have to adjust our statistics and questions about what we measure, as you said. Because, if you start from just the sort of the Western framing of employment versus unemployment, you're going to end up with implausible growth strategies that are not going to do justice to the real nature of employment. And particularly, they're going to make assumptions like, well, in Europe and Asia, people left the farm and went to the cities and got jobs. That is not the model of what is happening now. And so, I think it's a quality of growth, yes, and quality of jobs, but also a much richer, deeper, multifaceted understanding of the real political economy of countries here.
Thank you so much, Mark. So we're going to open the floor now to your questions. I think we have colleagues with mics around the floor. We'll take maybe a couple questions at the same time. Okay, so the front row right here.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah. And if you could just introduce yourself briefly.
Son cravate, je l'amènerai demain, Karim. Je suis désolé. Je suis à côté d'un ministre, donc no. Thank you very much. I really appreciate the thanks to Karim and the center, Shema and the growth team and CGD. I think I really enjoyed this conversation, and I really believe we are in a turning time in the thinking, and I hope it will translate itself into policy making on development. And thanks to Mark, I think your report published in last December, the growth report, and I really invite all the colleagues here to read it, because that is really the starting point of this turning point in the thinking on development. And Yemi, you also raised it quite well. And I think we are moving from an era of standardization of economic policy. And despite, in fact, the effort made by structural adjustment in rebuilding, in fact, the macroeconomic capacity of a lot of countries, reducing the risks, the macroeconomic risks, but I think it opened an era of standardization of development economics, development policies in the country, and that, Yemi, I totally agree with you on the issue of replicating what happens outside. I think the most important word and recommendation of your report, Mark, and what you were saying and this conversation, I think is opening the doors for experimentation in development. And that is really the most important message and the headline of this new era. Danny Rodriguez said, making development as a self-discovery. And I think the new era is to open up the doors like what Morocco did. I don't think that Tunisia can do the same, because Yemi, you are right. It's different history, although countries are quite close and sometimes competing on issues. But I think it's really, we need to experiment new policies to respond to local challenges. And that really the most important challenge for development thinkers and policy makers in this new challenging and with a lot, Alexandra, I totally agree with you, Alexia, sorry, challenging word with a lot of uncertainty. Just one word, Mark, what Patrick told us last time on Côte d'Ivoire, he told us that Côte d'Ivoire not only was more advanced than Morocco, but they were at the same level of South Korea.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you for that comment. And I welcome questions as well. Please introduce yourself and brief questions, please.
Excellent. Hi, Karan Nagpal. I work on issues of economic growth and state capacity in India. A bit of a provocative question, on this panel, we've heard many adjectives applied to growth, resilient, quality, deep, etc. One of the challenges of strategy is choosing what not to do. So, of course, in an unconstrained world, we could have all these nice things, but in today's environment, what should countries give up, and what should they actually choose, given the fact that we do live in a constrained environment?
Excellent. Thank you. I think there was one more in the back in the middle. Yeah, just in the middle. Go back. If you raise your hand again, sir. Raise your hand. Yep, in the back. Thank you.
Thank you, and good morning. My name is Ken Gishinga, and I'm the chief economist at Mentoria Economics, based in Nairobi. Now, on June 25th, 2024, we had massive Gen Z demonstrations in Nairobi where young people went to parliament, attacked parliament, and really said the growth model, we talk about 5% growth every year, is not working for them. And they said this has to change. Jobs are not being created. And we really have to think about how to change our economics. And when I think about our monetary policy, we've talked a lot about stabilizing the macros, inflation targeting, but we are not seeing enough work on unemployment. And it's true, you can't use the models of the West in terms of measuring unemployment, but the impact is the same. These young people are losing dignity, they're losing hope. And what is happening in Nairobi is also happening in other cities. Yesterday, I spent some time with some students here at the university, and they told me it's true. Even for them, getting jobs is very difficult. Money is not circulating in the economy. In fact, I tried to buy coffee there. I had 100 dirhams, and they said they can't get change. They don't have enough change. And they said, okay, do you have Apple Pay? I said, I don't have Apple Pay. And they said, I asked them, do you have M-Pesa? They don't have M-Pesa. So they told me the poor people don't even have mobile phones. In Kenya, even the mama mboga, the small person can interact, but here they were unable to get currency. So for me, I think the issue of money circulation, and the reason money is not circulating is because the government has crowded out the private sector. So much debt, so much borrowing, and very little is going towards the private sector. They're able to make those mental linkages. So I think it's very important we talk about government's role in crowding out the private sector and how that is limiting money circulation and limiting jobs and opportunity. Thank you.
Excellent. Lots of questions around state-led, market-led models, and also looking at growth rates in the context of demographics as well. There was a question on this side. We're doing equal opportunity. There you go, sir.
Thank you. Thank you very much. My name is Mugo Kibati from Nairobi, Kenya. To both of you, Yemi and Lord Brown, you both referenced this seminal speech by Prime Minister Kani at Davos, where he spoke about if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. And I think about Africa, and this is a great forum, and I thank you for the invitation. But I wonder, with everything you've talked about, changing geopolitical world order, going back to might makes right, advancements in technology, AI, where Africa is, frankly speaking, not at the forefront, and the fact that we need to look at our own internal policies because of the failure of the last several decades, going back to the 1970s industrial policy. With all these things happening at the same time, and African leaders, national leaders, having to focus on their own nations and what they have to do in the context of all this. And with the Zambia example you just gave, about the values now being replaced by interests. Do you think, what forum can, and also, I think Yemi spoke about our, not having, African countries not having the leverage to negotiate for what they need. What forum can Africa use to negotiate? Because I believe strongly, when I watched 2025 after the election, the swearing in of the new American president and the decisions that he quickly made, I watched a flurry of meetings in the EU, the European Union. We had different prime ministers and presidents calling all their colleagues for quick series of meetings to discuss the future of Europe vis-a-vis the new order, and Latin America as well. But I didn't see that happening on this continent. We continue to play the same old game of, my president in Kenya, presidents and leaders in different countries engaging as if nothing has changed. And we have the AU that meets every year in February in Addis Ababa, in my view, asleep. Is it too unwieldy? Is the AU the forum, or what forum on a policy level to negotiate on behalf of the continent? Because we cannot do it as individual 54 countries. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we'll take, you almost got applause there, I see, from Zainab. We'll take one last question, please.
Thank you. Tristan Reed from the World Bank. I have a question for Ambassador Dipiolo about Nigeria. In the last decade, you've had significant macroeconomic challenges, but also success stories in the growth of heavy industry in particular, becoming a net exporter of fertilizer, source of outbound FDI and cement, and recently the refinery. Do you view these as successes of industrial policy in Nigeria and government leadership, or things that happened in spite of the government?
All right. So we have a specific question for you, Yemi, and then questions around what not to do, how to prioritize, questions around just actually it's not working. We still need way more jobs. The kids are out on the streets protesting. Questions around, is the state crowding out the private sector? And then where is the space, the fora for leadership and organization? Yemi, you start.
Thank you very much. Some of your questions remind me of facing an exam panel in postgraduate school. But let me say, I'll just respond in general, and hopefully what I say will cover the issues raised. I think I totally agree with Hakim, who, by the way, was my director at the UNECA and former Minister of Finance and Economy of Tunisia. So he should also be taking some of the exam questions. I agree with you about there must be an open door for experimentation. But experimentation can go two ways, as you know. Experimentation can lead to innovation, but it can also lead to great disaster because some of the populists also thought they were experimenting. So I think it's important to have some guardrails in that regard. What not to do, I think, is a very good question. But interestingly enough, it's pretty straightforward. Don't indulge in populism. Don't engage in corruption. But perhaps most importantly, don't impose policies without reflection. And I'm glad you used the example of India. When India liberalized in 1991, which people like to use as an example, I don't know how many people realized that accompanying those policies was the M document written by Monteka Lualea, which was to give the trade and industrial policies to back up that liberalization. Not many people know that. So again, don't just say, they say we should remove subsidies, we will remove them, and then you think you've achieved something. You have to reflect. Then monetary policy, I think, you're actually talking on both sides of the divide. The important point you made about unemployment, I have to concede. Even the Federal Reserve talked about employment. And so recently, the central bank in my country issued a statement, a monetary policy statement, and not a word about the state of unemployment. So a friend of mine went on TV to say, guys, You didn't talk about unemployment, and yet the Federal Reserve talks about unemployment every time they talk about inflation. So you have a major point there. But please don't romanticize the private sector. Very important for innovation, very important for the competitive spirit. But just to say in one sentence, remember that even in the most advanced countries, they have what they call competition policy, right? So you are not dealing with a set of benevolent guys who just looking after the interest of the population. They're after their pocket, right? And I'll link that to the question which I really am itching to answer on whether Nigeria's successes are due to industrial policy or not. They are, interestingly, but it's in a very incoherent manner. Do you know why Dangote was able to do the cement? Because President Obasanjo made a policy that if you wanted to import cement into Nigeria, you had to build a factory of the size of the amount of cement imports you were trying to bring in. That's the fact. And then once that was established, you opened it up to other people who had similar interests. You have to show that you are investing in what you are trying to import. Talking of the refinery, do you know that in order to support the Dangote, the federal government took a stake in the Dangote refinery when he was facing his most difficult moments? The Nigerian government took a stake through the NNPC. Now the refinery is functioning. Do you know that they've had to introduce the concept of selling fuel to him in Naira to help him overcome some of the balance of payment constraints? So yes, there's a bit of industrial policy, only it's incoherent. So it's not as if it was because you devalued the Naira or you opened up the market to imports. No, there was a bit of industrial policy there. And I end with the African thing about Europe was able to respond, Africa couldn't respond. You're not totally fair to Africa. There was a time, I referenced Presidents Obasanjo and Mbeki, who tried to mobilize some thinking around Africa. And some of the gains that we've got in that regard, including admitting Africa to the G20, are a result of that spirit of trying to work as one. But ultimately, and we must remember this, the EU is, I forget the phrase we used to use, but the EU is, okay, I put it the other way around. Africa is 54 different countries. The AU is still an aspiration. It's not yet that instrument that can speak on behalf of Africa all the time. I think I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Well, I must say, it takes non-Europeans to think that Europe has responded well to Trump. It's not our view. And, you know, the ultimate shame was when it took Greenland to sort of get our governments onto the front foot on this. So, you know, I think, and I would just echo where Yemi finished, you know, having been in the UN in the era of Obasanjo and Mbeki, who between them were great regional sort of power brokers, come diplomats, come resolvers of conflict, when you had a generation of prime ministers and presidents like Meles or Kagame, both controversial in their own countries for prioritizing development over democracy, if you like, or Chissano and her his prime minister Luisa Diogio in Mozambique, you know, there was a quality of leadership which is largely, I suspect, missing in the continent now. And I can say that because it's certainly I can make the same point about Europe, and certainly about the United States. So, you know, I just think there is an issue and why? Because in some ways, if I go now to the African point, you know, the choices are getting much more complex. In a sense, you're lucky to have the Meles phase of this, the startup phase, where to go to the Indian question, it seems to me, it's not actually, it doesn't matter what your choice is, but you have to stick to that choice, because it goes to Akim's point earlier. You know, we're entering an era of development experimentation. Different countries are going to find their own paths to development. But what I think you will find in those countries is a deep the ones that succeed will be the ones that stick with it. And as they succeed in their first goals, add goals as their means and headroom to do so increases. But they won't keep flitting backwards and forwards. So Cote d'Ivoire is very much focused on a private sector-led development, some of its neighbors on a health and education-led development. Who wins? I think the one that sticks to the game and then adds in the other priorities as it moves forward. So let me just very last point, because I know we're over time here, which is to just say on the Gen Z and the June 24 protests in Kenya. To my mind, given the demographics of Africa and the youngest population in the world on this continent and the dire employment figures, however you measure it, it's striking to me that we haven't lost more of the old leaders to Gen Z revolts, and that where there have been Gen Z revolts, how many of them have held on. In South Asia, actually, we've seen rather a different outcome in Nepal, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, etc. And, why have they hung on? Because, partly lack of organization amongst protesters and crackdowns, obviously, but also this, again, very dispersed nature of African economies. And I think as you move towards something more recognizable as an industrial, urban working class, I think the prospects for these older governments to hang on will become very much less. I think we will see a much more responsive politics. And as that happens, we will also see groupings like the AU hopefully regenerated and revived.
Thank you so much. So 3 quick points to close out this first opening panel. Number 1, what a wonderful appetizer to this growth summit. Much more to come. Number 2, there are lots of resources on what we've been discussing that exist, and I want to point out 2 in particular. One is the growth team's Export Boom Atlas that has lots of lessons learned over 82 countries. So look that up, and also Assets Africa Transformation Index. And of course, my third point is thank you to our fabulous speakers, Yemi, Mark Malley Brown, and to your great questions. Thank you very much.
Esteemed speakers, please remain on the stage for the group photo.